Anatomy of posterior triangle of the neck. So the neck is divided into two triangles, interior triangle and posterior triangle, by the muscles called sternocleidomastoid muscle. In this image, the sternocleidomastoid has been removed. This is the cut end of the sternocleidomastoid superiorly, and inferiorly this is the cut end of the sternocleidomastoid. This bone is the clavicular bone. Okay, so the sternocleidomastoid muscle, this is the sternocleidomastoid muscle. It divides the neck into two triangles. Interior to it is the interior triangle, and posterior to sternocleidomastoid is the posterior triangle. Okay, then the boundaries of the posterior triangle. So posterior triangle interiorly, this is the posterior, right? Interiorly is the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. Then posteriorly is the trapezius muscle. Okay, apex is formed by the meeting point of these two muscles, sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscle. Okay, and the base is formed by the clavicle. Okay, so this is the clavicular bone. This is the posterior triangle of the neck. The posterior triangle of the neck is divided into further two triangles by the inferior belly of the omohyoid muscle. This on the 21 number, this is the inferior belly of the omohyoid muscle. So in superior to inferior belly of omohyoid muscle is the larger triangle. Okay, and the larger triangle, this one is the main posterior triangle. Okay, also known as the occipital triangle, and the inferior to it is the smaller triangle, which is called subclavian triangle. Okay, so the contents of the posterior triangle, it contains the spinal accessory nerve. Okay, this one on the 1 number, you can see this structure which passes behind the sternocleidomastoid to enter into the posterior triangle is the spinal accessory nerve, which innervate the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscle. This one on the 61 number is the trapezius muscle. Okay, so the posterior triangle contain the spinal accessory nerve. Okay, it also contain the phrenic nerve, roots of the phrenic nerve. Okay, so you can see this on the 64 number. This is the rami of the fifth cervical nerve. So from the rami of the fifth cervical nerve, as well as this third and fourth cervical nerve, the phrenic nerve originates. So on the 39 number, this is the roots of the phrenic nerve. Okay, phrenic nerve originates from the C3, C4 and C5 cervical nerve. Okay, so the posterior triangle also has cervical nerves. Okay, then the posterior triangle also contain the branches from the cervical plexus, include this nerve on the 16 number, which is interior to sternocleidomastoid, is the greater auricular nerve. Okay, this muscle, this nerve, okay, on the 25 number, this is the lesser occipital nerve. Okay, so these are the uh, contents of the in a posterior triangle. Now the subclavian triangle contain the third part of the subclavian artery. Okay, inferior to inferior belly of the omohyoid muscle as the subclavian triangle, which has the which has third part of the subclavian artery, which is not shown in here. Okay, so the posterior triangle also contain the third part of the subclavian artery. Then at the base of the posterior triangle there are muscles which are on the 40 number. This is the scalenus anterior muscle. On the 41 is the scalenus medius muscle. On the 26 is the levator scapulae muscle. Okay, so these are the muscles which are present in the posterior triangle. Now this artery, okay, this is the transverse cervical artery, okay, which comes from the thyrocervical trunk of the first part of the subclavian artery. Okay, so these are the contents of the posterior triangle.